It's one thing to conclude that the mainstream media is deeply biased when it comes to Israel's onslaught against Gaza, based on what you can see and hear. But it's another to have that proven with facts. Now, that's because you often hear a logical fallacy, which is mainstream coverage of Israel-Palestine is criticised by both those who align themselves with the Israeli state and those who align themselves with the Palestinian people. Therefore, it must be correct. It's annoying everyone. Therefore, it's neutral. Now, you often hear this whole narrative with the BBC too, based on criticisms of bias it gets from both left and right. Therefore, it must get the balance right. Now, that's a logical fallacy. Whether a broadcaster is biased or not should be decided based on various empirical measurements, not least given for uncritical champions of the Israeli state who are accustomed to receiving the total support of Western states and most Western media outlets. Anything which is seen to deviate from the official Israeli narrative is regarded as bias, even simply reports on Palestinians being killed. Indeed, as we can see with the British right and the BBC, in that strident right-wingers are so used to dominating the editorial position of British newspapers, so anything that deviates from that in the wider media, seen as outrageous bias to the left, is also a means of policing. If you have more institutional power than the other side, you can throw your weight around with accusations of bias to bully broadcasters into embracing your own side. And well, in the case of Israel-Palestine, the dispossessed Palestinian people who don't even have a state have very little collective power indeed, or even a prominent organised voice in Western states, so they're automatically at a huge disadvantage. That's why we need facts, which is why a new report published by the Centre for Media Monitoring on media bias in Gaza 2023 to 2024 is so important. Now, I've done previous videos with research looking at bias, studies into bias by the BBC, covering the bias of the BBC, as well as US media outlets. But it's so important that we have broader, wider studies. Now, this centre was founded by the brilliant Miqdad Versi. He's the media spokesperson for the Muslim Council of Britain. He's been an invaluable analyst of anti-Muslim prejudice and media coverage in the UK for many years. This report is authored by Faisal Hanif. He used to write as a newspaper reporter at The Times and a researcher at the BBC, as well as conducting field research for the Institute for Public Policy Research, a very prestigious think tank, and the University of Oxford Centre on Migration Policy and Society. So he knows what he's talking about. Now, it's worth just stating from the outset that this is a report on the media coverage of what is officially an alleged genocide. It's being investigated as an alleged genocide by the International Court of Justice, which is, of course, the highest court on earth. Now, that has already involved the mass killing of tens of thousands of Palestinians in a very short period of time, around 40% of whom are children, the mass displacement of almost the entire population, the mass destruction of civilian infrastructure, to the extent that Gaza now has a different colour and texture and looked at from space, conditions which now are apocalyptic in much of Gaza, the outbreak of famine, projections by researchers of tens of thousands of likely further deaths in the coming weeks and months, repeated statements which indicate intent by Israeli ministers, which are clearly genocidal in nature, from demanding a total siege on human animals, favourably asking civilians and soldiers to remember the story of Amalek, in which God orders the killing of all men, women, children, babies and livestock, calls for Gaza variously to be wiped from the face of the earth, repeated calls endorsed by Israeli ministers for the entire population to be expelled. I could go on. They call it voluntary migration, which they actually mean you make the conditions so unbearable, you then present the removal of the population as a humanitarian gesture. Now, why do I say all this? Because mainstream media coverage is on a completely different planet from those realities. The way media coverage of, say, the crimes of Assad, for example, or in Bosnia committed by the Bosnian Serb armies, that's not obviously the way that this is being approached. It's framed overwhelmingly as Israel's military response to Hamas, with a side debate which is indulged not by everyone by any means, about whether it's proportionate or not. Not whether or not this is a huge, vast crime, in which critics are marginalised and stigmatised. What the report says is it seeks to establish whether the British media has done its job, fulfilled what is supposed to be its mission, robustly report the news, validate facts, and hold those with power to account. 2, as it says, reliably inform the public of the facts and share the position positions of all concerned and ideally in a responsible way. Now, any good faith reading of this very impressive report show the media has failed badly in that regard. Now, the report looks at key TV channels and online news services like the BBC channels, ITV, Channel 4 News, Sky News, Channel 5 News, GB News, Talk TV, Al Jazeera, CNN. Now, as the executive summary notes, news coverage tends to treat the 7th of October as ground zero. That is when the clock begins. Those referring to the historical context of a 75-year-old occupation of Palestine with all the mass, violent, ethnic cleansing, terrible crimes committed, what international human rights organisations define as apartheid. We could go on. Those attempting to do any of that are accused by some presenters and columnists as justifying the attacks of the 7th of October, the atrocities that were committed on the 7th of October. Now, the coverage strips away context and history, not least how Gaza, which was still under occupation as per international law before the current invasion by the Israeli state, and which suffered a blockade since 2005, how all that benefits an Israeli narrative. And in the words of the report, has constantly promoted the attacks on Gaza and in the West Bank as a war between light and darkness. Meanwhile, pro-Israeli voices and talking points regularly lead news reports, even as the numbers of Palestinians slaughtered has increased exponentially, ensuring that Israeli life has repeatedly been given unashamed prominence or blatant prominence over that of Palestinian life. The death toll of Palestinians itself has been repeatedly delegitimized with hateful language towards Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims has on occasion not even been challenged. Claims made by official Israeli sources and Israeli journalists have, the report notes, been amplified and accepted as truth without verification. And even when proven to be false, some aren't corrected nor challenged when repeated, despite the long track record of Israel's authorities prior to any of this of lying through their teeth. It adds that pro-Palestinian voices and activists have been routinely denounced, misrepresented and targeted by many national media outlets. The right-wing media has been particularly hostile towards pro-Palestinian voices, framing them as supporters of terrorism and anti-Semites, as well as being hostile to British values. Yes, well, I think I can speak to that. But that's clearly been particularly the case with Palestinian voices and also disproportionately, for example, Muslim voices. Now, the media has taken cues from politicians in smearing pro-Palestinian advocates, and despite arrests, protests being lower than that at Glastonbury Music Festival, the narrative of them being a danger to public safety persists, while legitimate shows of solidarity with Palestinians is conflated with the genuine evil of anti-Semitism. The research finds how there's emphasis on Israel's rights, that means often to the exclusion of Palestinian rights, and how that's used to shut down pro-Palestinian voices and legitimise official Israeli claims. Now, in this detailed research, so 147 pages, they find that the evidence we have gathered shows unequivocally that the overall tone of coverage in the Western media has been pro-Israel. So key findings include that 76% of online articles frame the current war as an Israel-Hamas war. Clearly, that frames this on terms favourable to Israel, because in practice, Israel has waged an onslaught based on mass collective punishment, with any pretense of a targeted attack on Hamas in practice just non-existent, ludicrous atrocity denial to even indulge that idea. It seeks to frame this as Israel, Hamas, if you talk about in those terms, as legitimate state versus terrorism, with the Palestinian people simply non-existent in that framing. So to underline that point, only 24% of news reports mentioning Israel or Hamas or Gaza mention the words Palestine or Palestinian. So you can just see there the erasure of the Palestinian people, of Palestine. Al Jazeera English news channel itself has more mentions of occupied territories than all British and American news channels combined. So the entire dynamic of what this actually is simply not there. The insistence on Israel's right, so for example, Israel's right to defend itself, was found on 1,482 occasions across broadcast channels. A similar search for the rights of Palestinians to resist yielded only 278 results, and 36% of those were from Al Jazeera English alone. Now, in broadcasts where emotive language is used, Israelis are about 11 times more likely to be referred to as victims of attacks compared to Palestinians. We're talking terms like atrocity or butchered, massacre, slaughtered. That led 8 anonymous BBC staff to challenge management on why terms like massacre and atrocity were only used for Hamas. Now, over 70% of the terms atrocity, slaughter, massacre were used in reference to attacks against Israelis on the 7th of October, of course, even though it must be said far, far, far more Palestinians have clearly been killed. Terms used to describe the deaths of Palestinians are sometimes qualified with phrases such as what they say is a massacre. In online British news outlets, emotive terms were found to be 4 times more prevalent when describing the actions of Hamas against Israelis compared to the description of the killings of Palestinians or civilians in Gaza. So the study found that TV reporting of Israeli perspectives was referenced almost 3 times more, that's 4,311, than Palestinian ones, 1,598. In online news, it was almost twice as much, nearly 3,000 versus over 1,700. GB News and Talk TV made up 42% of total references to protesters being pro-Hamas, so clearly those right-wing channels leading the charge at demonising protests against this onslaught. The report finds a deluge of Islamophobia, like Talk TV hosting one right-wing historian who declared that for many, Muslim hatred of Jews is motivated by religion far more than politics, adding the true roots are to be found in the Quran, which encourages hatred of Jews and the killing of the infidel, before adding that the hatred of Jews infects much of the Muslim world. Just clear, rampant Islamophobia. There were no challenges to any of those points by the host. It finds the report that, given, as per the UN, Gaza was under existing occupation due to the permanent land, sea and air blockade imposed by Israel, supply of goods heavily restricted, as well as water and the majority of electricity supplies dependent on Israeli authorities. Israeli authorities even control the electromagnetic spectrum, even the civil registry. That context just almost entirely absent. Constant use of the term Hamas-run health ministry. Interestingly, until 17th of October, Palestinian health ministry was still widely used. Then the use of Hamas-run health ministry increased dramatically. Now, why does that matter? Because clearly what that's doing is putting in people's heads the idea that that's just propaganda from Hamas, which you should not believe. Even though those official statistics have been validated in every single previous conflict between Israel or any kind of military conflagration involving Israel and Gaza, even though they released the names and Israel-approved IDs of all victims when Joe Biden questioned that tally, even though the prestigious prestigious medical journal Lancet confirmed the figures were not being inflated, even though US sources and Israeli sources, both publicly and privately, have said that those figures are likely to be correct and actually underestimates, because, again, I keep saying this, it doesn't include the numbers who are buried under the rubble, many thousands. So that context is simply stripped away, and instead the idea is to sow the seeds of doubt. This is Hamas propaganda, even though all the evidence shows that the death toll is not being exaggerated, it's being understated. Now, the mention of Israel's right, that term, versus mention of Palestinians' rights is really striking. The BBC has 81% Israel's right versus 19% of Palestinian rights. Channel 4 News, I think somewhat surprisingly, you might think it might be better in this regard, 100% it has Israel's right compared to talking about Palestinians' rights. ITV, also 100%. Sky News offers 4% for Palestinians' rights. The report mentions repeated references by news presenters implying collective guilt on the part of the people of Gaza because of Hamas's election in 2005, when they won a plurality, when the vast majority of Gaza today didn't even vote in that election. On BBC Newsnight, terms like inhuman animals were used to describe Palestinian civilians by Israeli voices with no pushback. In one case, Channel 4 News platformed an IDF veteran who'd taken part in the 1948 Deir Yassin massacre of Palestinians, a horrific atrocity. He'd previously declared of Palestinians, erase them, their families, mothers and children, these animals can no longer live. That information wasn't included in the interview, and in the interview he made clear he thought most Palestinians were responsible for Hamas, with statements lacking challenge, but frankly it was an outrage that the broader context was missing there. The extreme opinions of the Israeli ambassador to the UK, Zippy Hotovelli, completely ignored in her 44 UK broadcast appearances in the first month of this horror, such as her statements like, the land is ours, all of it is ours, we did not come here to apologise for that, declaring between the sea and Jordan River there needs to be only the state of Israel, while also declaring that from the river to the sea is genocidal in nature when used by Palestinian supporters. So she's fine to use terminology calling from the river to the sea in practical terms when she's talking about only an Israeli state and therefore the subjugation of Palestinians under apartheid, but it's genocidal when supporters of civil rights for Palestinians use such a term. She also described the 1948 Nakba, the mass expulsion of Palestinians, as a lie. Well, you'd think she'd be interrogated about these things, about her views. Not so. She also repeatedly spread debunked claims, such as that there were 40 beheaded babies on the 7th of October. And indeed, the report notes that the claims of 40 babies being beheaded were widely shared by media outlets, despite the fact that we know from Israel's official statistic that one Israeli baby was killed on the 7th of October. That's terrible enough, by the way. The killing of any baby is horrible. Shot through the door of a safe room, with 36 children in total being killed on the 7th of October, either because of Hamas missile strikes or bullets in the main. The report notes my own appearance with the Labour MP Margaret Hodge 3 days after 7th of October, in which I very clearly condemned Hamas and their attacks, and then Hodge demanded I condemn Hamas as though I hadn't done so at all. Clearly I had, at length actually. It's just gaslighting when you're in that situation. You're just like, what? Why am I doing this? And then when I attempted to talk about why it was illegal under international law to impose collective punishment on a people and spoke about Palestinian children suffering and how thousands of Palestinians had been killed between 2008 and that date before 7th of October, I was accused of having an obsession with Palestine. They know how Palestinian guests are routinely misrepresented, such as when Sky News suggested the Palestinian ambassador to the UK had said the Israelis had it coming, when actually he'd mourned the loss of life on all sides. He'd actually said Israel knew this was coming their way. They looked at how pro-Palestine protesters are repeatedly smeared as pro-Hamas, as anti-Semitic and a danger to Jews. Overall, what this report really shows is how Palestinians are dehumanised. That it's ingrained, that's so ingrained, it's a background hum in the British media, that Israeli narratives are so dominant, and again, so dominant they become a background hum, that Palestinian life is clearly treated as having far, far less worth, that the sort of mass violence used against them is in any way being framed and even suggested as violations of the norms or laws of war. That's those who critique the onslaught who are treated as though they're in the dock. The idea of the Palestinian people having rights, just not even there, really. Narratives which, frankly, help justify the mass slaughter of the Palestinians lacking real challenge. We could go on. I mean, it's so rampant and so overt and so unapologetic. You know, it just makes you realise, you know, when, you know, we live in a democracy with caveats, is a phrase I often use, which is, you could say, well, we have a free media, don't we? It's not all directly controlled by the government. Doesn't really need to be, does it? When you just have media outlets which are clearly twisting reality. And that's what is happening here. It's not the actual truth, the full truth of what's happening. It's selective. It's distorted. Why does all this matter? It's because Israel's onslaught is only possible because of the support and complicity of Western states through weapons, aid, diplomatic and political support. If media outlets were not so weighted in favour in their coverage of the Israeli state, there would be far more public pressure for Western states to shift their position, in turn putting huge pressure, therefore, on Israel. That's why we have to state the obvious truth, that our media outlets are complicit in what is a historic crime, and that the mass slaughter of the Palestinians and the unimaginable suffering they've endured, and will, I'm afraid, continue to endure for a very long time, there's still perhaps the worst horrors yet to come. Well, our media outlets played a crucial role in all of that. And that underlines a basic point, that the campaign to change this media ecosystem is a matter of life or death on a large scale. Please like and subscribe. Do share this video, get the message out, listen to the podcast, and you can keep the channel on the road on patreon.com/Unanswerable. I'll speak to you soon.